therapists. It can be very, very difficult to put your tongue and your mouth in the right position to articulate well.
Yes, this is true. And it's interesting because when babies are born, they can differentiate between different sounds. So a Japanese baby is born, and when they're born, they can differentiate between the sounds of a r and lif, or rice and lips. But by the time they're 3 months old, because they haven't had that constant exposure to those sounds, they lose the ability. So when you, as an adult, start learning, you've got to really start training your ears, first of all, so that you're actually hearing sounds before you can start producing them.
Oh, that's a good tip. And what about some of the misconceptions about being a speech therapist?
I think a lot of people think it's elocution and just lists or stuttering, and it's so much more than that.
As you've said, that's right. And as we communicate, as long as we can get the message across, it's okay, isn't it? Or do we have to be perfect?
Absolutely. No. People have to be effective communicators. A lot of the children and young people I work with are non-speaking communicators, so they use alternative or augmentative communication to communicate with other people. So they may have a communication book, or they may be using a device that gives a voice and allows them to type words in. Everyone remembers Stephen Hawking. He'd be one of our most famous AAC users in the world, but that's becoming more and more common.
What are some of the alternatives to verbal communication? He had his way. What are some of the modern ways?
The issue for a lot of people is access. So if you've got hand use and you can isolate a finger and activate a touch screen, you could use something like an iPad with a communication app on it. If, however, you've got a really complex body and you can't isolate your fingers, you can use switches to activate communication devices. So you can have head switches or knee switches, and you can use the switch to click along and then select the word that you're looking for or the message that you want.
Some people, Joanne, have sent through some examples of the A and the S. The S and the T and the H. Aesthetic. That's a good one. Anaesthetist. And then Mary has said strong string stretches. I'm not sure why that's there. That's more elocution, isn't it?
Yeah, but quite fun to say those things.
Yeah,
I think if words are tricky for people, just slow it down, do your syllables, slow it right down, and just practice until you've got it a bit more smoothly.
Slow it down, that's right. And in terms of people we can relate to, or maybe we can't relate to them specifically, but we know who they are, they're well-known people. Who has used speech therapy?
Well, I can tell you the first mention of someone with a speech problem is actually Moses in the Bible, in the book of Exodus.
Really?
He says to God, I am not eloquent, but I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue. So it goes back to the history of mankind, people having communication difficulties.
He was pretty famous.
Like Tiger Woods, Bruce Willis, Joe Biden, George VI, they've all had stutters. We've spoken about Stephen Hawking, who's a famous AAC user. There's an American comedian called Carly Fleischman who uses a communication device on her shows. So it is becoming more mainstream. I think if you've got significant language or communication issues, you're probably not going to be very well known. 60% of people in prisons have got underlying communication difficulties.
Do you work in prisons at all?
I don't, but I am going to start working in the court system as a court-appointed communication assistant for young and vulnerable people going through the legal system.
Oh, that's a good idea. So what will your job entail there? Is not speaking for them, but giving them a voice?
Just helping them understand what is happening and encouraging people, talking to the young people to use appropriate language that
they really know what's going on. Yeah.
Because there's no point. No, if you don't understand what's happening in life, people just switch off and tune off and aren't engaged at all.
Well, very good, Joanne. That's been most interesting in your day job I'm sure you don't have a night job, but as a speech language therapist. And I'm sorry we've taken so much time out of your day.
No, that's fine. And I just wanted to say that I think access to speech therapy is an area that we could be working on in New Zealand. I had 60 parents message me about their difficulties accessing help for their young people and the constant battles, and so many people are having to go private to access it, which isn't very equitable at all.
Very good. Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you. You take care. Bye.
You too. That's our expert on speech language therapy, Joanne Byrne. It's now 5 minutes to 3. Don't forget at 3 o'clock we cross to the Beehive for that announcement. When and if we go to level 1, and we'll join that live. But leading up to the 3 o'clock news, let's listen to Krungbin and Time.
That's life. If we have one time, we can live forever. Just you and I, we can be together. That's life. We can buy my children right. We can tie my children tight. Just you and I, have we got the time? Make a plan for when we all reminisce when we get home. Just you and I, have we got the time? Do you know? Here we go. That's life.
RNZ National with Krungbin, and the track is called Time, in brackets, You and I. Very cruisy, wasn't it? It's now coming up to the 3 o'clock news. Following the news, or perhaps during the news, we'll be crossing to the Beehive to the live announcement of whether we are going to level 1 and what that might entail. And then after 3...
Kia ora koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Good afternoon. Today is day 26 of Alert Level 2 and day 17 without any new cases of COVID-19 in the country. Today is also day 75 of being in a COVID alert level of any kind. Our team of 5 million has both sacrificed and achieved a huge amount in just under 11 weeks as the world reckoned with and continues to reckon with a virus that went from obscurity at the start of the year to a global pandemic that will linger, with second waves a constant reality. As it spread rapidly around the world, we all saw people losing their loved ones and their livelihoods at a rate that was never acceptable to us. And so here in New Zealand, we went hard and early with a single plan that had a dual purpose: to protect lives and to protect livelihoods. Self-isolation for all returning travellers came into place first, 17 days after our first case. We closed our borders to everyone but New Zealanders 20 days after our first case. Our first economic package, including the critically important wage subsidy scheme, was in place 19 days after the first case. Most other countries took more than 40. And then New Zealanders did something remarkable in our fight to beat COVID-19. We united in unprecedented ways to crush the virus. Our lockdown was in place 26 days after our first case, when we had just over 200 cases. Google tracking showed that during our lockdown, New Zealanders massively reduced their movements by 91% to retail and recreation, better than Australia, the UK, the United States, and nearly every other place we have compared ourselves to. Had we not acted, 11 days into our lockdown, we were projected to have 4,000 cases. We had 1,000, and one of the lowest rates per capita in the world. That was what the sacrifice of our team of 5 million was for: to keep one another safe and to keep one another well. And as much as we could, we have. We acknowledge those, however, that we have lost during the course of our battle against COVID-19. But we have worked together as well as we could to look after as many New Zealanders as possible. Our goal was to come out the other side as quickly and as safely as we could too. A place where our borders continue to be our first line of defence, but where all current rules and restrictions on businesses and services are essentially lifted. Where all the rules for hospitality, such as single service, separated tables and people being seated, all end. Where there is no requirement for physical distancing in workplaces and public places. Where all gatherings of any size can occur. Where life feels as normal as it can in the time of a global pandemic. And today, 75 days later, we are ready. Today, there are no active cases in New Zealand. We have tested almost 40,000 people for COVID-19 in the past 17 days, and none have tested positive. We have had no one in hospital for COVID-19 for 12 days. It's been 40 days since the last case of community transmission, 22 days since that person finished their self-isolation. And so today, I can announce that Cabinet has agreed we will now move to level 1 to get our economy fully open again, and we will start almost immediately. We move down to COVID-19 alert level 1 from midnight tonight. With over 100,000 new cases being reported each day, the challenge of COVID remains around the globe, and so it remains here. We are not immune to what is happening in the rest of the world. But unlike the rest of the world, not only have we protected New Zealanders' health, we now have a head start on our economic recovery. That's because at level 1 we become, if not the most open, one of the most open economies in the world. Oxford University publishes a government response stringency index ranking countries from 0 to 100 in terms of their level of restrictions. Before today's move to level 1, New Zealand was at 33.3, while Australia, for example, was at 62.5. We were already nearly twice as open as they were. The Reserve Bank's analysis shows the economy under level 1 is expected to be operating just 3.8% below normal levels. That's an improvement from the estimated 8.8% below normal levels under level 2, 19% below normal levels under level 3, and 37% under level 4. And it was encouraging to see economists recognise that activity under level 2 was also stronger than expected. Westpac last week said the economic recovery was tracking faster than expected, and that activity like heavy and light traffic movement and electricity use is back to or above pre-COVID levels. Zespri too has reported that despite the global challenge of COVID, exports are well ahead of last year. 5.7 million more trays shipped this season so far than last season, along with its highest sales yet in Europe as demand for healthy produce grows. At level 1, we expect the continuation of recovery. After all, at level 1, we can hold public events without limitations. Private events such as wedding functions and funerals without limitations. Retail is back without limitations. Hospitality is back without limitations. Public transport and travel across the country is fully opened. This freedom from restrictions relies so heavily on the ongoing role that our border controls will play in keeping the virus out. But we must remain mindful of the global situation, the harsh reality that the virus will be in our world for some time to come. We are confident we have eliminated transmission of the virus in New Zealand for now, but elimination is not a point in time. It is a sustained effort. We almost certainly will see cases here again. And I do want to say that again. We will almost certainly see cases here again. And that is not a sign that we have failed. It is a reality of this virus. But if and when that occurs, we have to make sure, and we are, that we are prepared. That's the reason our borders remain our first line of defence, as we aim not to import the virus. Borders remain closed, indeed, at 15 of our 17 comparable countries as well. Our managed isolation and quarantine at the border will continue, and it will be as important as ever as we know this is a potential pathway. And that is key because we want to not just move to level 1, we want to stay there. And so there is a key ask that I have of all of you today, and of businesses. We're asking that businesses and services where the public visit or enter to provide people the opportunity to maintain their own diaries of where they have been. And so our all-of-government team will continue working with sector groups, businesses, hospitality firms, churches, schools and others to encourage them to display QR codes via posters at the entrance of premises, as most of you will have seen at businesses who are out and about it over the weekend, so that everyone can maintain their diaries via the New Zealand COVID Tracer app. Manual sign-in is no longer required, but we do ask that you put up a QR poster at your door of your premise if you're a business so people can scan it and just keep a record for themselves. Ongoing improvements will be made to ensure these QR posters are as accessible as possible for businesses. We have also worked with the events sector on a voluntary code to ensure attendees' details are captured at these bigger events where we know the virus can spread more easily across larger groups. The reason for that is simple. If we get 1 or 2 cases in the future, which will remain possible for some time to come due to the global situation and nature of the virus, we need to shut down those cases fast. The last thing, as I say, we want to do is move back up the alert level system again. So, this is a key new behaviour we're asking all New Zealanders to adopt at level 1. You can do and go wherever you like. We just ask you keep a record of where you have been by scanning in or just by noting down your movements for yourself. I have one more thing to ask. At level 2, agencies have been managing the return of employees to work with around 50% of people back at their places of work last week. Now, at level 1, you can, unless you feel unwell, go back to your place of work. There has been some fantastic adaptation over the past couple of months with flexible working. And this is progress that has helped people with care arrangement, has also helped people to avoid congestion And those are things we should not lose. But we can balance that with also ensuring that we have thriving CBDs. For our part, we've asked the State Services Commission to issue new workplace guidance to make it clear that every public sector worker should return to their usual place of work, taking into account flexible work policies. We've got to level 1. Now let's make our next goal supporting our recovery right across the economy. I know that having such a firm sight on success for so long has sometimes made the road we've taken seem longer and the steps we've taken seem more laboured. At every step there have been those who have pushed us to do something different, to go faster or further, but our collective results, I think, speak for themselves. That caution and hard work got us down the mountain safely when the descent is always the most perilous part. Moving to level 1 now is the dividend for everyone's hard work for now. But we need our team of 5 million for the next phase, and that is to get New Zealand moving again, as we move from the collective call to action to unite against COVID-19 to unite for recovery. I encourage you to buy, play and experience New Zealand Made to get our country moving again. Consider it an extra form of support to visit our country, to buy our local products and to support our local businesses. For my part, this week is about the government's recovery efforts and focus on jobs, and you'll be seeing that in my agenda. Tomorrow, I'll be in the Bay of Plenty, visiting a kiwi fruit and avocado pack house to discuss how we can further assist the sector to attract workers, noting horticulture has already picked up some 2,000 workers who have lost their jobs due to COVID. I'll also check in with our mana and mahi scheme that gives employers the equivalent of the unemployment benefit to hire those who might be reliant on it. At an electrical business installing solar power and heat pumps and panels and heat pumps in Tauranga. On Wednesday, I'll be in Kaikoura for a tourism announcement. On Thursday, I'm in Auckland making a health infrastructure announcement, and on Friday, following our 30 billion investment to protect jobs and restart the economy due to COVID, I will speak at a Vision Week summit, where I'll share further details of how the government is working with business on New Zealand's economic recovery and rebuild from COVID-19. While we're in a safer, stronger position, there's still no easy path back to pre-COVID life. But the determination and focus we have had on our health response will now be vested in our economic rebuild. And so while the job is not done, there is no denying this is a milestone. So can I finish with a very simple thank you, New Zealand. Dr. Bloomfield, I now would like to hand over to you and give you the opportunity to say a few words.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Kia ora koutou katoa. Just 3 things I'd like to say. First of all, it's obviously very satisfying that not only do we have no new cases and haven't had any for 17 days, but we also have no active cases in New Zealand. And no, we haven't been saving that up. We found out about that yesterday afternoon. As you know, the cut-off for our cases is at 9 o'clock each day. It's a coincidence, but I think a nice and timely coincidence. The second point I want to make is that, and like the Prime Minister, I want to thank people who have worked so hard to achieve what we've achieved over the last few months. And many of those people are in the public service, many of them are in the private sector, and many of them have been those essential workers that in particular made many sacrifices while we were in lockdown to keep the rest of us, help keep the rest of us safe. But actually the reason we are where we are today, and maybe have done better than we might have hoped, is because New Zealanders acted together in our collective interests, and we will need to continue to do that. And my final point is to the question, the inevitable question is, could we have come down through the alert levels faster? I would just simply say we have come down faster and sooner and in a stronger position than any other country. Yes, we have been cautious, but we have not been overcautious, and that cautiousness has been part of our success. Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you. Ready to take questions?
Why have you broken?
Sorry,
why have
just
you
I'll
broken-
just go and then I'll come to you, Jane.
Why have you broken with tradition and not given people 48
Yep.
hours? And how much of a part did New Zealand First have to play in that decision?
To answer your second question, nothing to do with it. The simple reason is that for most of the alert levels, you'll recall that we've had to put in enforcement provisions. So make sure that the orders are ready so that we can legally enforce any requirements that we're setting around things like mass gathering. At alert level 1, the restrictions simply remain at our borders. So there was no reason to have to leave a time frame to bring in those provisions. So that means we could move quickly, and so we've done that.
Even on Friday, the Finance Minister was saying, look, we have traditionally done 48 hours.
Yes.
Has the thinking on that changed since
No, and that has always been the case. And so what none of us, and you will have heard me say the same things, what none of us wanted to preempt was simply that Cabinet may have chosen, or there may have been some element of the decision making that may still have an enforcement feature to it. And so if that were to have been the case, we would have needed 48 hours. As it happens, there are none. So we've moved as quickly as we could. We know that will ease the pressure on particularly hospitality, particularly the transport sector. Now we'll be able to safely fill those planes, fill those buses, and cafes can get a few more tables into their spaces as well.
Any discussion about?
Oh, sorry, Jane,
Any
yes.
discussion about borders with now obviously the last remaining thing in place? Any more idea about timetables, or is that as long as it has to be?
Yeah, and look, what I would re-emphasise is that our border is critical. The reason that New Zealanders, as of tomorrow, will be able to move around with freedom that very few other countries in the world have is because we are maintaining those restrictions at the border, so they will continue to be critical. And that means applying a really critical analysis if and when we come to a position where we believe another country is in a similar position to us and therefore we can safely travel between. We haven't put an arbitrary timeline on it because that simply comes down to a judgment that does rely on daily data, and it's simply the case that at the moment those decisions we are just not ready to make yet.
What was your immediate reaction when you heard there were no active cases of COVID-19 remaining in New Zealand?
I did a little dance. Definitely not. I showed Neve. She was caught a little by surprise, but she joined in, having absolutely no idea why I was dancing around the lounge, but enjoying it nonetheless.
Yourself, Dr. Bloomfield?
I'm not quite as good a dancer as the Prime Minister.
You have no evidence to base that on.
Well, my children, I'm sure, would opine on that. But I did, I've been described by one commentator this week as intense, but I did allow myself a broad smile.
And just moving back to the borders, the fact that we've moved to having no COVID, does that make it harder, and do we want that from other countries? Does that make the threshold even higher for them to prove that they're not going to bring it in here?
Oh, and look, this will be two-way decision-making, of course, with anyone with whom we're opening our borders up with, keeping in mind, of course, there are Pacific Island nations asking or seeking the same open movement. What both sides need to make sure is that we're confident that we're not risking each other's status. So that will be critical for New Zealand, given our current position, but equally it will be critical for others. Most people are focusing on Australia, of course, and I think we do need to keep in mind that they had roughly, from memory, half a dozen cases, I believe, yesterday or at least over the weekend. They have had community transmission. We will need to move cautiously here. No one wants to jeopardise the gains New Zealand has made, and so we will be very, very careful when we make those decisions. Gina, to finish that question?
Perhaps make more sense then to move to the Pacific, where countries like Rarotonga, they've been calling for it, they don't have any cases.
Yes.
Would it make more sense to form a bubble?
We'll just make sure that when we work up a framework for making those decisions, we are keeping in mind that our Pacific neighbours within the realm, so Niue, the Cook Islands and Tokelau, some of which are calling for that travel. So we do need to make sure that whatever framework we set up will work across a range of different countries, but the focus has initially been on the Trans-Tasman bubble.
Prime Minister, how hard are we going to fight for the elimination strategy? That's more extreme than just about any other country in the world. What are the...
Do you mean the eradication or elimination?
Elimination. Is there a chance we could go back to level 4 just to try and keep it down to 0?
Oh, I'll give Dr. Bloomfield a chance on that question.
Thanks, Prime Minister. So, yeah, just the elimination strategy again, it's not a point in time. What I would say is at this point, we're confident, very confident we have eliminated community transmission in New Zealand. That's a fantastic position to be in. But to maintain that, we need to continue our very strong border measures for the time being, and of course to make sure we've got capacity and capability to test for and identify cases and contact trace and so on and so forth. I was asked last week, is there a plan B? And my response was, I haven't seen a better plan as yet. And that is, I haven't seen a better plan for the health and healthcare system, and also for the economy, from if you look at other countries. And I think if you do the rounds around the world, for the countries that have gone into lockdown, we have come out faster than other countries have been able to. Many are still in lockdown and or are easing lockdown measures with still high numbers of active cases in their community.
So can businesses, though, really be sure that we're never going to go back to level 4?
Well,
Exactly.
Yeah, and so in response to that, I would say for all those who have questioned whether we've moved too slowly, we've done so precisely for the reason that we wanted to move with more certainty, to lessen the likelihood as much as we could that we would end up going backwards. So it's my strong view that we've done that. That does not mean we will not have cases in the future, but I do think it improves our chances of, if and when we do, to make sure that we're able to manage those tightly with all of the processes that we've set up, be it contact tracing, the rigorous testing, with our quarantine and isolation. And so that's what that's all designed to do, is to try and prevent that escalation again.
And is that threshold, is it still around the 200 cases the last time we went?
No, look, again, I think using cases is a bit of an arbitrary measure, when actually, again, as we've talked about all the way through, what you know of those cases is incredibly important. If you had 30 cases, but they are all in quarantine and all came in from outside, and we've held them all at our border, then that's a very different scenario than if you have 30 that have come up through community-based testing.
WHO has changed its position on masks. Dr. Bloomfield, you've always said you're monitoring advice overseas. Will you implement what the WHO is advising here, or do we not need it?
Well, I think two things about the WHO advice. I'm not sure it's changed its position in terms of its reading of the evidence, which remains the same as ours. The balance of benefits and risks is very close, and it depends on the setting. And what their advice was that where you have got ongoing community transmission, masks can play a role in terms of general public use. That is clearly not the situation in New Zealand, but we will obviously keep a very close eye on whether mask use could play a role as we move into the future, and if we get more cases and potentially further community transmission. So at this point in time, though, our advice stands. We don't think masks, we don't recommend or require masks.
Minister, the Children's Commission released a really raw and upsetting report today into the experiences of Māori mothers dealing with Oranga Tamariki. Can I ask what your response to that report was, if you've had time to read it? And secondly, there's a second report coming, and that will actually have recommendations. And so the question is, will you commit to implementing those recommendations without actually seeing the report?
Yeah. Well, look, what I'd say first of all, of course, any situation where a child is removed from a family is devastating, and we are actually all in the position of being completely of the same view that's a situation no one wants in this country. But we equally have very high abuse rates in New Zealand, and so we equally are all united in wanting to change that for our children and for Aotearoa. What I would point to is that actually since July 2019, we've finally been funding ways of doing things differently, and there hasn't been a huge amount of time to allow that new way of working to be given a bit of a chance, and to allow that new focus of working really closely as well in partnership with iwi. We have another examples of where that's been happening, to give that the chance to work as well. So we'd all agree change is required, and I'm seeing the signs of that, but equally I still see the devastating stories as well.
Has said that every New Zealander should read the report. Will you commit to reading the report? Do you suggest the same?
And so look, as I say, I've had the report. I've gone through some of the summary elements of the report. I haven't had the chance to go cover to cover. Obviously the Minister has, and I've spoken with her about the report as well. And so we have been keenly focused on supporting, resourcing and working alongside Māori to change some of the outcomes that we are seeing. And we have seen, more than 80% now of Māori children are placed with Māori caregivers or are being looked after by their own whānau now. That's making a huge difference. We have seen the fewest entries into care in 2019 since 2004. And we have been working really closely, as I say, with iwi and with whānau ora to change up the way that OT is operating in many circumstances. But it is going to take us some time, but I think you can see the commitment is there. Yeah, I'll come.
Prime Minister, when will the government stop paying for people going into quarantine at the border?
Yeah, so this is something that we've been working with the All of Government group around. I expect to receive some advice in the coming weeks on this and decisions thereafter. So I can't give you a number off the top of my head. Obviously, maintaining the strict requirements that we have and ensuring that we have the border agencies there present, monitoring that people are fulfilling their expectations, does come at some expense. But obviously COVID in New Zealand comes at an even greater expense.
The importance of that border,
Yep.
would you look at perhaps making more long-term investments in the security of that border, perhaps building dedicated facilities instead of using hotels?
Yeah, and look, keeping in mind that we actually have had at least a struggling hotel sector while our borders have remained closed. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well. Originally, you'll recall that we used camper vans, but this actually was a way that we could make sure that we're providing adequate facilities, but also monitoring and ensuring that people were behaving as they needed to be in a large group. Keeping in mind, when we used the camper vans, it was a small number. Now we're quarantining thousands.
The reports that the security at some of those hotels is not quite watertight. We've heard of people walking through a crowd of Avatar filmmakers.
Yes, you're using the QT as an example. I might throw to Dr. Bloomfield because, of course, the Ministry of Health and others have been involved in that quarantine situation.
Yeah, I think the QT situation is a first, in that it was a private group that has come and funded that arrangement. We're learning about that, and I think the thing that I'm most interested in, and I've asked my team to look at, is whether there are any of the non-Avatar people using that facility who may have been at any risk. It doesn't appear so, but the key thing is if anyone feels they have been at risk, they should seek advice either through Healthline about getting a test if they think that's worth it.
Contact trace those people at the hotel at the time?
No, we haven't actively contact traced because it had nothing to show us yet that anyone was put at risk. So saying, it's a different arrangement from the very managed isolation facilities we have in Auckland and soon starting up in Wellington and Christchurch as well. And so we've learnt and will be ensuring that the arrangements for any future privately organised arrangements like that are strong.
Keeping in mind the Ministry of Health did assess them and are present, so obviously they're involved, but these are ones where they're paying for them themselves. Benedict, and then I'll come to you, Jane.
What is our testing regime going to look like at level 1?
Yes. So the border plays a very strong role in our testing regime for reasons that you can imagine. But perhaps I'll throw to the Director General. It's something that the Minister of Health is going to report to us on an ongoing basis around as well.
Yes, so to build on what the Prime Minister said at the border, we are starting this week testing of everybody coming across the border who is arriving, whether they are symptomatic or not. They'll be tested twice during that 14-day period. We will also be doing surveillance testing of anyone working at or around the border, so regular surveillance testing there. So the border, these are a couple of the measures we're putting in place to strengthen the border. And likewise, our community-based testing will continue with very much a focus on anyone with relevant symptoms to ensure that we are still detecting if there is any potential COVID-19 over these coming weeks. So they'll be the focus.
More GP-based rather than like those pop-ups that we've seen with all the cars lined up?
It will be a mix. So as it's been a mix to date, some designated practices, we will still see some CBACs, we'll see some mobile clinic testing, and we will see GP testing as well.
Have you ever signed off on a foreign embassy being accessed by New Zealand authorities, including the SIS? Are you aware of it having happened in recent times? And should foreign embassies expect to be inviolable, that they shouldn't be accessed without their knowledge while in New Zealand?
Yeah. So a couple of things broadly, keeping in mind the role of Minister Little versus the role of myself. So that may be questions that you wish to place before him. As a general statement, though, what I would say is the world in many, many ways is very different than it was in the 1980s. Keeping in mind that the New Zealand SIS does have to maintain strict legal frameworks that are set out in legislation passed in 2017, and that they are also audited. They have strict oversight as well by the Inspector General of Security Intelligence. And so those are functions and checks and balances that exist in our system. So even though we don't have a tendency to comment on individual cases, and I don't want to do that on those past and present, we do have a very different framework than we've had in the past as well.
Would that legal framework prevent that happening again, or would it just mean that it wouldn't be reported in a way that many other activities aren't reported despite...
Again, that does not stop them having a strict legal framework that they must operate within, and it does not change the fact that they do have oversight via the Inspector General as well.
Saying that any activities...
An independent Inspector General.
That any activities that might be outside the law would be reported.
Functions and roles of NZSIS have, of course, the provision of an independent Inspector General sitting over the top of them.
If the SIS did raid foreign embassies in New Zealand during the 80s, what would be an appropriate response now?
Again, I think the most important point I can make is that the 1980s was a different era, and of course that we have strict legal frameworks that our New Zealand SIS operate within now.
Reports that Russian spy Sergei and Yulia are living in New Zealand under new identities. What truth is there to that?
Yeah, so I think, one thing I do want to be careful here of is not creating a precedent where I'm commenting on individual cases or individuals indeed, but I think what I can say is don't believe every piece of speculation that you read.
For New Zealand to provide a safe haven for them in particular?
Again, there's probably no need for me to get into a hypothetical, but as I've said, you shouldn't necessarily believe everything you read.
So the level 2 regulations, including that sort of warrantless entry power for police that caused a lot of consternation a few weeks ago, are those still going to be enforced under level 1?
No. And so as we made really clear at the time, those were provisions to enable us to enforce the restrictions that existed. And at level 2, we did have restrictions on mass gatherings. We did need the ability to enforce those if issues were raised. My understanding is that they were used on one occasion. But now we don't have such restrictions, and so they will not be used.
Elaborate on that one occasion when they were used?
I don't know any more detail other than that it was in the South Island.
Do you see any merit in our national public health agency that's been talked about? It might be a bit early to comment on that, but obviously, there's varying levels of how prepared we can be for public health crises. Do you see a role for something like that?
Yeah, when it comes to public health, and this is something I've spoken about many, many times, it has, over a successive number of years, not been valued as it should. And New Zealand, I think, is now more aware than ever of the work and the existence and the importance of our public health units. But they do much, much more than just what they've been doing through COVID-19. They are the ones that we turn to when we have measles outbreaks, when we're trying to deal with issues like rheumatic fever, when we are trying to prevent some of the inequalities we see in healthcare in New Zealand. They should be well supported, and it should be well coordinated. And so you've heard already some of the changes we've been willing to make, and I think it's a journey we'll keep going on.
Something in particular that you personally are looking forward to doing at level 1?
Well, actually, to be honest, many of the things that perhaps I missed really changed at level 2. Level 2 was, I think, probably for many New Zealanders, the most dramatic jump in going back to normality, and you can see that in some of the numbers that we've had coming out around Kiwis' behaviour and in terms of those economic measures that we might use. And so for level 1, I think probably the thing that I'm most pleased about is knowing that our artists, our creatives, the ones who earn an income and a living out of being able to share their art with gatherings of people, that's something that we'll be able to bring back. And that also means a big difference for our faith communities, for people planning weddings, for those who've been delaying large funerals.
With the relaxation of social distancing, do you have any advice around hongi?
I don't have advice around hongi. I've said before, I think that's a decision for individual iwi to decide on. And I think it relates to hongi and also other, less, other cultural practices, including our own, of often giving a hug or a kiss or an air kiss, as it were. So I think people just need to be a little bit thoughtful about that, but I will leave it to iwi to decide around hongi.
Yes, Araha.
One of Māoridom's biggest festivals is the Matatini,
Yes.
where we share our traditional culture through dance. Last week you spoke about talking with some of these music festivals. Are you
Yes.
speaking with Matatini on their festival?
Yeah, actually, I had a Zoom meeting some weeks ago, which included representatives from Matatini, who acknowledged the support that the government had put in to really support them through this period, because of course there's been issues with sponsorship and making sure that we can continue on the regional work in the lead up to Matatini at Eden Park in the future. So hopefully with that support we'll see Matatini as strong as ever, because I think it's just a festival that it is just going from strength to strength.
You've got one more cabinet meeting before the caretaker convention kicks in 3 months after the election. I was wondering if you could share your interpretation of that convention and whether you plan to make significant sort of political announcements sort of heading into that 3-month period, or how stringently you're going to respect that convention essentially.
Yeah, well, of course I expect to hold up the guidance of the Cabinet Manual as any other government. I think probably the area where it's very clear cut is making sure that we change our behaviour around significant appointments, for instance. So if there's anything that's really pressing, then you would look to share that and discuss that with the opposition. Otherwise, I think it's something that we're well versed in. Obviously, significant spending decisions are made by and large through budget mechanisms, and now we have the job of just continuing on an agenda that means we're supporting New Zealanders in our recovery.
The Trans-Tasman bubble, when do you expect to
And
be
then I'll
able
come
to
to Bernard.
announce some kind of date around that? When are
Yeah.
you looking at?
Ultimately, I don't want New Zealand businesses in particular, or even Kiwis who might be wanting to travel across the ditch, to be given a false start. I'd rather share timelines when we have much more certainty, and at the moment we just don't. We do need to act cautiously. New Zealand is currently ahead of Australia in terms of our progress. They are making progress state by state, but it's not universal. So we will keep up those conversations with Australia. We will keep preparing, but I do not have a date to share at this time. Bernard?
How long can our economy cope with these sorts of travel restrictions, the level one restrictions?
Yeah, well, I think it's quite a difficult question to answer, given keeping in mind we are still trying to work through mechanisms to bring home those who would be ordinarily resident here, to work through areas where parts of the economy might be held back and hundreds of jobs might be lost because of particular individuals with skill sets that we cannot access in New Zealand, can come in. And of course we've got to work through how we restart safely things like export education. So at this stage I'd say it's too soon to put numbers around that when there are a number of issues we need to keep working through, but we are doing that in earnest.
You said earlier that New Zealanders should buy local.
Yes.
Why then did KiwiRail spend $250 million on work by Chinese and South African-owned companies to electrify the Papakura to Pukekohe line?
Two things I'd say on that. I'll be sharing the same expectation with SOEs that I'm sharing with everyone, that of course within the bounds of our trade rules and expectations, that at the we do want to see everyone doing what they can and doing their bit to support New Zealand's recovery. At the same time, should acknowledge that any successful bid in that area though is obviously going to be looking to New Zealand labour, given the situation we have at our border at present.
Do you have an estimate
Garrett.
on, because the wage subsidy is being extended, I think, do you have an estimate on how many employees no longer be under when it's extended?
No, we've had an estimate, and I'd want to get the revised number from Treasury around their estimate of uptake. But of course, it will very much depend on the status of the business for, you know, a 30-day period for the 40 days prior. And the reason that we've given them that ability to, you know, not necessarily take an exact period is there is still the potential for some businesses to have experienced a real post-exit, post-isolation bounce that might not have been sustained. And so it is quite hard to estimate how many will use it and therefore how many employees will be affected. But we'll keep giving the same reporting we have in the past.
To have David Clark remain as Health Minister until the election?
I've said many, many times, he is our Health Minister and I have no plans to change that. I'll take the last couple of questions.
Will businesses be required to display the government QR codes? I understand that was something that Dr. Bloomfield had asked of the government.
Yeah, and we have discussed this very point. And we have talked to the retail sector, hospitality, restaurant sector. And at the moment, what we've opted for is to continue to work with them to make it easier for their members to access the QR code. At the moment, accessing the QR code does require you to have your business number and Real Me. We're trying to work on ways where actually we're dispatching out to businesses their QR code to make it easier. So while we're still doing that, we've kept it at voluntary. We will keep working with the sector, and we're keeping open the option of mandating that in the future. But at the moment, we're going to work together, and I do think that we can improve people's access to it. Okay, all right. Thank you, everyone.
Has found the chest. So what he did is he